There are places where the air itself remembers. Not in whispers. Not in echoes. But in the way it refuses to change, as if time itself refuses to move forward. The Wexler farmhouse, deep in the woods of rural Pennsylvania, was one such place. In the summer of 1821, a traveling merchant claimed to have seen something wrong with the color of the air as he passed by the property. When the sheriff and 2 townsmen entered, they found the Wexler family seated neatly around their long oak dinner table. 7 plates, 7 chairs, 7 faces, locked in expressions neither alive nor dead. Each figure was pale, stiff, and rimed with ice. But the curtains billowed from the open windows, letting in the heavy July heat. The stew in their bowls steamed as if freshly served. No one could explain how they had frozen solid in the middle of summer. No one could explain why every clock in the house had stopped at the same moment, 8:17. And no one dared to speak of the way their eyes seemed to follow whoever entered, right up until the lids slowly shut. For over 2 centuries, the details were buried under folklore and family warnings. But now, the truth has found its way to the withered ledger, the only record that refuses to let the dead stay silent. What happened that night was not an act of nature. It was an act of will. And the one who willed it has not gone away. The merchant who wouldn't knock. The summer of 1821 in western Pennsylvania was a season of contradiction. The air felt thick enough to drink, the grass sharp with heat, and the sky a slow-moving brass plate that pressed itself on the land. But to Amos Hargreave, the road that led toward the Wexler property was worse than any sun-scorched mile behind him. Amos was a merchant by necessity, not choice. His father's debts had left him carrying a wagon of goods across the state, trading bolts of cloth, jars of molasses, and rust-flecked tools to farmsteads too far from town to see the inside of a proper store. He had passed through dozens of properties that summer, each heavy with the same baked earth scent of August, until he came to a bend in the road where the air changed. It was not the kind of change a man could name. No breeze, no shadow, no shift in the light. Only that the heat no longer pressed against his skin. It hung near him instead, like a curtain he had stepped behind. The smell of dust and pine was gone, replaced by something colder, thinner, the way a basement smells after a winter flood. He slowed the mule to a stop. From where he sat on the wagon bench, the Wexler farmhouse was visible through a gap in the trees, a pale, rectangular body against the green. The windows were open, curtains billowing outward, yet he saw no movement inside. Not a figure, not a shadow. The fields around it were oddly neat, the rows of corn standing stiff, their leaves unmoving. Strange, he muttered, though speaking aloud made it worse. His voice seemed to catch in the air and not return to him. Amos had been told to deliver a length of muslin and 2 crates of vinegar to the Wexlers. They were known to be punctual payers, private folk who kept to themselves, but not inhospitable. Still, as he urged the mule forward, the wagon's wheels grinding against the dry ruts, something in his chest resisted. By the time he reached the start of the Wexler drive, he had begun to sweat again, but only on his back, where the sun touched him. The air ahead still carried that strange coolness, as if the house and the ground around it were pulling the warmth out of the day. He stopped again, this time at the edge of the property. The drive was just 2 parallel lines in the dirt, leading up to a yard bare of animals. The coop was shut tight. The barn stood open but empty. And then he noticed the flies. Not buzzing in clouds, not landing on him, just hanging in the air in a slow, suspended way, as if they had forgotten how to move. Their wings twitched, but their flight paths were wrong, incomplete, like figures drifting in syrup. A shiver passed over him, though the sun was still on his face. He could hear his father's voice in memory, warning him about houses where the air won't carry sound. Such talk had been old superstition, a traveler's way of explaining why some places made the hair stand up on your arms. But Amos had learned, in years of trading, that such places existed. He clucked his tongue at the mule. The animal did not move. Its ears were rigid, its gaze fixed on the house. Amos felt the hesitation rise in himself as well. From the distance, the open windows looked inviting, almost expectant. But he could not see any sign of the family. No children in the yard. No smoke from the chimney. He took off his hat, wiped his forehead, and stepped down from the wagon. The dirt of the Wexler drive was colder than the road he had left. He could feel it through the thin soles of his boots. He took 2 steps, then stopped. A sound reached him, faint, brittle, almost like glass cracking. It came not from the barn or the yard, but from the direction of the house itself. The noise repeated, irregular, and he realized it was coming from inside. Amos swallowed. Only wind, he told himself, though the air was still. He shouldered the crate of vinegar and started up the drive. But when he reached the halfway point, something made him turn his head toward the open barn. Inside, the shadows seemed wrong. They were not stretching away from the light but toward it, like spills of ink running uphill. His breath caught, and the crate slipped in his hands. One bottle shattered, the vinegar soaking into the dirt. He stood there for a long moment, waiting for something, movement, a voice, the sudden appearance of one of the Wexlers at the door. Nothing came. The thought entered his mind uninvited, do not knock. It did not feel like his own thought. It came with a strange calm, like the memory of advice he had always known. He set the crate down where he stood, turned, and walked back to the wagon without once looking at the house again. The mule was already tense in its harness, as if it had been waiting for permission to move. Amos climbed up, flicked the reins, and the animal bolted forward faster than he had ever seen it go. Only when the trees closed in behind him and the air grew thick and hot again did he breathe fully. His hands were shaking. 2 miles later, he stopped at a creek crossing and sat in the shadow of a willow. He told himself it had been foolishness, heat fatigue, a trick of light, perhaps a sickness in the air near the property. But even as he tried to reason it out, he knew he would never go back there. When he reached the next township, he gave the account to the constable, careful to omit the parts that would sound like madness. He said the family might be ill, that the place was strangely cold, and that he had left their order in the drive. The constable agreed to send a man to check. Weeks later, Amos would learn that the man sent never returned. And that was when the first rumors began, the kind that carried over years and miles, until they reached the withered ledger, where the details no longer had the comfort of doubt. For the truth was not in what Amos had seen. It was in what he had felt. That if he had knocked, the door would have opened. And he would never have left again. The dinner that would not die. The constable, Matthew Rourke, was not a man given to superstition. At 43, his world was built on practical habits, an early rise, black coffee, and a list of duties written in neat block letters on a scrap of paper tucked into his breast pocket. He had no time for ghost stories, no patience for the nervous talk of men like Amos Hargreave, whose account of the Wexler place was delivered with the breathless pace of someone trying to outrun his own words. Still, something in Amos's story lingered, the wrongness of the air, the stillness of the flies, the refusal to knock. It was not the kind of thing you wrote in an official report, but it stayed in the mind like a splinter. On the morning of August 3rd, Rourke saddled his bay mare and set out for the Wexler property with 2 other men from the township, Walter Penn, a farmhand whose loyalty was unquestioned, and Elijah Marin, a preacher's son known for his steady aim with a rifle. The sun was already punishing by the time they reached the bend in the road Amos had described. They all felt it at once. The air changed as if they had stepped under a vast shadow. The heat seemed to stop pressing on their skin. Rourke pulled his coat tighter without realizing why. Penn muttered that he could see his breath, but Marin laughed, until the sound of his own voice seemed to fall flat, cut short in the space between them. The mare slowed on her own, hoofs striking the dirt with reluctant thuds. The road ahead was perfectly still, the branches of the trees holding their positions as if painted there. When the house came into view, Rourke understood why Amos had turned back. It stood clean and white against the green fields, but the windows were too open, the curtains moving in a way that did not match the faint wind on their faces. He dismounted, tied the mare to the fence post, and told the others to keep their eyes open. The yard was quiet. No chickens, no dog, no sound of human movement. The 3 men walked up the drive. The ground was colder here, just as Amos had said. Penn frowned and stamped his boot, as if testing for frost beneath the dirt. At the front door, Rourke knocked 3 times. The sound was sharp, but it did not carry, as though it had been swallowed by the wood itself. There was no answer. He tried the latch. It lifted easily, and the door swung inward without a creak. The smell hit them first, not rot, not the stench of something dead, but something colder and more metallic. Like the inside of a root cellar after snow melt, tinged with the faint sweetness of bread left too long in the oven. They stepped into the main room, boots striking the wide oak boards. The air inside was colder still, enough to raise the hair on their arms. The dining room lay directly ahead, lit by the full glare of the summer sun pouring through 2 wide windows. And there they were. 7 figures seated around a long table. The Wexler family, Elias, the patriarch, at the head, his wife Miriam to his right, their 4 children along the sides, and an elderly woman at the far end, likely Miriam's mother. Each sat upright, hands resting neatly near plates of steaming stew. Steam, in this cold. But their faces. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, the veins faintly visible like cracks in porcelain. A thin rime of frost clung to their eyelashes and hair. Elias's lips were parted slightly, as though caught mid-word, but there was no sign of breath. The children's eyes were open. Rourke felt an animal urge to step back, but he forced himself forward. His boots made a dull crunching sound as they passed over a thin layer of ice that had formed on the floorboards nearest the table. Penn whispered a prayer. Marin lifted his rifle without realizing it. The stew in the bowls was not frozen. It steamed gently, carrying the scent of beef and onions. Beside each bowl, a silver spoon rested, except for the one nearest the youngest child, a boy of perhaps 7, whose spoon was raised halfway toward his mouth. The stew clung to it in a thick, unfallen drop. Rourke leaned closer to Elias Wexler. The man's pupils were pinpricks, the irises glazed like glass. Frost feathered the edges of his collar. Yet there was no slackness in his posture, no sign of collapse. It was as though every muscle had chosen to remain exactly as it was. And then Rourke heard it, faint, almost lost beneath the ringing silence. A slow crack. Like ice shifting on a winter river. It came from somewhere beneath the floor. Penn swore under his breath and stepped back. Marin's knuckles whitened on the rifle. Rourke forced his eyes away from the table and scanned the room. Every clock, on the mantel, on the far wall, above the sideboard, had stopped. The hands were frozen at the same point, 8:17. He opened his mouth to speak, but the cold seemed to tighten in his throat. That was when Miriam's head turned. It was not much, no more than an inch, but enough to shift the frost on her collar. Her eyes locked on his, the glaze unbroken, the pupils still pinpricks. Rourke stumbled back into Penn. The man hissed through his teeth, crossing himself. Marin lifted the rifle fully now, his breath quick. But Miriam did not move again. The crack beneath the floor repeated, this time longer, sharper. Somewhere far below, something sounded like it was pressing against the beams. Rourke felt the cold in his bones now, not just on his skin. It was the kind that seemed to slow thought, to make the edges of reality less certain. They backed toward the door, none of them turning their backs fully on the table. When they stepped outside, the sun's heat hit them like a blow. Penn dropped to his knees, gasping. Marin cursed and spat, muttering that the family was not dead, but something else. Back at the township, Rourke filed his report with careful omissions. He noted the condition of the bodies, the temperature discrepancy, and the frozen clocks. He did not mention the movement. He did not mention the sound beneath the floor. But that night, alone in his home, he could still see Miriam's eyes. And somewhere in the distance of his mind, he could hear the faint, slow crack of ice, waiting for something to give way. 8:17. The clocks would not leave him alone. In the days following his visit to the Wexler farmhouse, Constable Matthew Rourke found himself seeing them everywhere. In the township hall, in the church, even in the small brass pocket watch he had carried for 20 years. It always began the same way. He would glance at the time and find it normal. 10:45, 2:12, 6:09. But if he looked again, the hands had shifted to 8:17. The movement was never gradual. It was as if the time had been replaced when he was not looking. On the third morning, he smashed the pocket watch against the edge of his desk until the face cracked. But even the shards seemed to hold the shape of that hour. Sleep did not help. In dreams, he found himself back in the Wexler dining room, standing at the head of the table. The family sat frozen, steam curling from their bowls. Sometimes Miriam's head would turn again. Sometimes all of them would, their eyes following him in unison. And always, when he looked to the clock above the mantel, it read 8:17. He stopped going to church. The preacher's voice seemed to distort in his ears, as if speaking from beneath a frozen pond. His appetite vanished. He began visiting the property alone at night, without telling Penn or Marin. The cold began before the house was in sight. By the time he reached the yard, the summer heat had been entirely replaced by a breathless stillness. He would stand at the threshold of the front door, never knocking, never crossing it again, just listening. The sound was always there now, beneath the floorboards, the slow, deliberate crack of ice shifting. On the sixth night, something changed. The front windows were dark, but faint light pulsed from the seams of the shutters, like the glow of a lantern moving behind a wall. It had a rhythm to it, 3 short pulses, a pause, then 3 long. Rourke found himself muttering the pattern aloud. It was only when the pulses stopped that he realized the house was listening. The following day, he combed through the township records, searching for any mention of the Wexlers beyond birth and marriage announcements. There was nothing unusual, no debt disputes, no land conflicts, no criminal charges. But in a drawer of the archive room, wrapped in yellowed muslin, he found an older ledger. The spine cracked when he opened it. Inside were handwritten entries by the previous constable, dating back 30 years. One entry caught his eye. November 12, 1791, Wexler House reports, time stopping, in the north field. Cattle frozen where they stood for 2 hours, then resumed movement. Doctor claims. No cause. The next entry was shorter. April 4, 1792, Widow Marin claims to have heard voices under the floor of the Wexler house. Rourke turned the page, but the next dozen entries had been blotted out with thick strokes of ink. That night he dreamed again, but it was different. He was seated at the Wexler table now, a bowl of stew before him. The warmth of it curled into his frozen hands. Elias Wexler sat across from him, the frost on his beard catching the light like glass dust. The man's lips moved, but the words were slow, stretched thin, and warped by the cold. When Rourke leaned forward, he could just make out the phrase, "You must hold it still." Then the clock above the mantel shifted, not the hands, but the numbers themselves, painted onto the face. They melted, ran down like wax, and reformed again as 8:17. He woke with frost on his breath. The next morning, Penn confronted him in the street. The farmhand's face was pale, his hands trembling. He claimed he had seen Rourke standing in the yard of the Wexler house the night before, staring at the front door for hours without moving. Rourke denied it, but Penn swore on his life it had been him. More troubling was Marin's account that same day, that he had passed by Rourke's home at dawn and seen the constable's mare tied outside, but no light in the windows. Something was wrong with his memory. The township hall clock struck noon as Rourke tried to collect his thoughts. But when he looked up, it was 8:17 again. The air in the room cooled, his breath fogging. No one else seemed to notice. The sound came faintly then, not from beneath the floorboards this time, but from inside his own ears, a brittle, cracking ice. By the end of the week, Rourke knew he would have to return to the farmhouse and step inside again. It was the only way to prove to himself that the place was not shaping his mind. He waited until nightfall, when the road was empty. The mare refused to approach the property, so he tied her at the bend and walked the rest of the way. The cold grew with each step. The barn's shadows bent toward him now, as if reaching. The front door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the family was exactly as he had left them, except the bowls were empty. The spoons rested in clean plates. Miriam's head was bowed slightly, as though in prayer. The clock above the mantel ticked now. A single, steady tick. The hands moved slowly, both reaching for the same point. 8:16. Rourke felt every muscle in his body tense. The air was sharp in his lungs. The tick came again. The hands shifted to meet. 8:17. The sound beneath the floor erupted, louder than ever before, a deep, grinding crack, followed by the faint rush of water. And then, for the first time, Elias Wexler blinked. The ice in the walls? The blink was small, but it was enough. Matthew Rourke stood frozen in the Wexler dining room, his breath clouding in the air between himself and Elias Wexler. The patriarch's eyes had closed for a heartbeat, then opened again, pupils sharp as pinpoints in the glassy blue of his irises. Rourke's fingers twitched toward the pistol at his hip, but he stopped himself. The air in the room had grown heavier, pressing in on him from all sides, the cold not a mere temperature but a weight. Then the sound began again, the slow, deliberate cracking from beneath the floor, now accompanied by a second noise, a faint, hollow thud, like water dripping onto wood far below. He backed away from the table, his boots crunching against the thin frost that had formed over the floorboards. His eyes caught on the walls now, the way the pale paint seemed darker in certain places, almost bruised. A draft brushed the back of his neck. It should have been impossible. The windows were shut tight, the curtains stiff with frost. Yet the draft persisted, carrying with it a damp chill that smelled faintly of iron and something sweeter, almost like overripe fruit left in the snow. He stepped closer to the nearest wall, pressing his palm flat against it. The cold that seeped into his skin was deeper than anything he had felt before, colder than ice drawn fresh from a winter pond. He jerked his hand back. His fingertips burned. Rourke's thoughts darted toward the cellar. He moved cautiously through the hallway, the sound of his own boots muffled as though the house had begun swallowing noise again. The door to the cellar stairs stood closed, a simple wooden latch holding it in place. Frost had gathered along the edges, and when he touched it, flakes fell like fine snow. The latch lifted easily. The door groaned open. A wave of cold rolled upward from the dark, so strong that it carried with it a scattering of brittle ice crystals, which drifted down the hallway and melted only after several seconds. He took a lantern from the sideboard, lit it, and began his descent. Each step was slick with a thin glaze of frost. The deeper he went, the more the walls themselves seemed to glisten, veins of ice running through the wood as though it had grown there. The air was thick with a muffled sound, a low, constant hum, so deep it seemed to be inside his chest rather than his ears. At the base of the stairs, the cellar opened into a single wide chamber. Barrels and crates lined the edges, their lids covered in frost. In the center stood the table from which the cold seemed to radiate, a narrow workbench, its surface etched with marks he could not decipher. Rourke moved the lantern closer. The marks were not letters. They were lines, curves, and intersecting shapes, some shallow, others carved so deep they had cut into the very grain of the wood. A fine, crystalline frost had gathered along the grooves. He reached out and touched one of the carvings. The cold jolted through him so sharply that he staggered back. The hum deepened. He turned toward the far wall, and froze. The ice was thickest there, covering nearly the entire surface. Beneath its cloudy translucence, something darker stirred. He stepped closer, the lantern light catching on what looked like shapes just beyond the frozen surface. Not roots, not cracks, but limbs. Small ones? The outlines were faint, like shadows caught inside a block of ice, but they were unmistakable. Thin arms, curled hands, the suggestion of faces turned toward him. Children. Rourke staggered back, his mind rejecting the sight even as his body accepted it as real. The ice shifted, faintly, as though something on the other side had pressed against it. The lantern flickered. The hum stopped. And then came the crack, loud, deep, splitting through the stillness like the snap of a tree in winter. A jagged fracture raced across the ice, the frost on the floor leaping upward in tiny shards. From somewhere far above, the dining room clock chimed once. Rourke turned and fled up the stairs, the cold chasing him like a tide. By the time he burst into a hallway, his breath came in sharp, tearing gasps. He reached the front door and wrenched it open, and stopped dead. Outside, the yard was not the same. The sun had gone. The sky was an even, suffocating gray, and the trees around the property leaned inward, their branches heavy with frost. The air had the flat stillness of a world before dawn, with no wind, no bird calls, nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat. And then he saw them. Figures standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the fence. 7 of them. Their silhouettes were still, heads tilted slightly toward the house. He could not make out faces, only the faint glint of frost along their outlines. He stepped backward into the hall, slamming the door shut. The sound beneath the floor began again. This time, it was accompanied by a faint tapping from inside the walls themselves. Not random, rhythmic. Like knuckles rapping slowly, deliberately, just behind the plaster. The tapping traveled, moving along the wall toward the dining room. Rourke followed, lantern in hand, his eyes fixed on the shifting bruises in the paint. He placed his ear against the cold surface. The tapping stopped. Then, a whisper. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it carried the shape of words. "Do not let it warm." Rourke stumbled back, his heart pounding. He turned to the table. The Wexlers sat unchanged, but frost had begun to creep up the legs of their chairs, spreading across the tablecloth toward the empty bowls. The clock above the mantel read 8:17. He backed into a hallway again, unsure whether he was retreating from the family or the walls. The tapping resumed, now behind him, leading him toward the study at the rear of the house. The study was small, the desk covered in neat stacks of papers sealed in wax. Rourke broke the seal on the top stack. They were letters, all addressed to the same person, none of them posted. The first words on the first page made his hands go numb. To the one who showed me how to keep them. Letters never sent. The sheriff had not planned on staying another night in the Wexler house. But dawn had never truly come, and he could not convince himself it was only his exhaustion. The light outside remained the pale, thin color of milk left too long in a bowl, and the trees beyond the yard were still without even the whisper of wind. He told himself it was weather, strange, yes, but weather nonetheless. And then the floorboard by the study door shifted under his boot, as though it had been waiting for the weight. It was the only room in the house the search party had not lingered in, for the simple reason that no one wanted to touch it. The Wexler study smelled not of dust or paper, but of old, damp stone, like the inside of a cellar that had never been dry. The sheriff found himself breathing through his mouth. A desk sat against the far wall, its drawers slightly open as though someone had searched them in a hurry. But on top, neatly stacked, were 3 bundles of letters bound in thin cord. The envelopes were all addressed, but none had postage. And each bore a return name, Elias Wexler. The first bundle, bound in black thread, was dated over a span of 20 years. The earliest letters were courteous, notes to suppliers, thanks to merchants for their deliveries, seasonal greetings. But as the years passed, the ink grew heavier, the script sharper, and the content stranger. There were requests for materials that will keep until called for, instructions for storage in rooms that must remain shut to sound. One letter, dated precisely 3 years before the dinner, simply read, "Do not come to the house after the first frost. I will not answer. The air will not be mine to breathe." The second bundle, tied in red cord, was different. Every letter was addressed to the same recipient, Dr. Alwyn Greaves, Philadelphia. The sheriff did not recognize the name. Here the writing was erratic, a man's hand pushed beyond its patience. Elias wrote of heat that arrives too soon, like an animal in the wrong season. Of drafts that carried the taste of ice even in harvest months. He spoke of an experiment, unnamed, unclarified, and of a seal that was never meant for our climate. One page, smudged to the point of near legibility, seemed to plead, "If the seal is broken, you must not enter the dining room. It will call you to it, and you will answer." By the time the sheriff opened the third bundle, tied in plain twine, his hands were shaking. These letters were all to one person, Dear Lydia, and they were dated during the very month the Wexlers had been found. But there was no Lydia in the town registry, and none among the Wexler's known kin. These letters were different still. They were not meant to be posted. They were confessions, written in a fever of guilt or fear. In them, Elias spoke of something older than the walls, colder than the stone. Something they had invited but not commanded. He wrote of a bargain, an exchange measured not in coin but in seasons. One line repeated across 3 separate letters: the heat was never ours to keep. It will come to collect. The sheriff's fingers lingered over the last page. On it was a single sentence: by the time you read this, we will be seated. The words throbbed in his mind like a pulse. He looked around the study and noticed, for the first time, that the frost had begun to spread across the desk surface, tracing out hairline cracks in the wood. It was not winter's frost, light and lace-like. It was heavy, wet ice, forming from the inside out. His breath hung in the air, and he became aware of a faint sound beneath it, the slow, deliberate dripping of water, as though the house itself were thawing. He stuffed the letters into his coat and backed toward the door. But the dripping followed him, not in sound, but in sensation, each step heavier, colder, as though the floorboards beneath him were soaked through with melt. In the hall, the light dimmed further, the milky daylight pressed into a thinner and thinner sheet, until it was almost dusk. The sheriff did not remember closing the study door, but when he glanced back, it was shut. Outside, the air was no warmer. The town clock still stood at 8:17. And the letters in his coat, warm when he had first taken them, were now cold enough to sting his ribs. The will of Elias Wexler. The document was not supposed to exist. At least, not in the form we found it. Sheriff Alden had been pacing the Wexler library for the better part of an hour before I arrived that morning. His boots made no sound on the thick red carpet, but the way he kept circling the heavy oak desk gave the room a restless pulse. The desk drawers had been pulled out and set on the floor like ribbed bones from a chest cavity. The contents, ledger books, dull fountain pens, unremarkable receipts, were scattered in a neat but deliberate fan, as though Alden had been afraid to leave them in the wrong order. In the center of the desk, there was a single sheet of paper, weighted at the corners by 4 brass candlesticks. The paper looked ordinary at first. A thin edge of cream, faintly yellowed, the ink dark and still sharp after who knows how many years. But I noticed something strange before I even read the first word. There were no folds. No creases. No signs that it had ever been stored away. It had been waiting. Alden didn't look up when I approached. "They told me this was destroyed," he said quietly, as if speaking too loud might tear it. "That after the Wexlers were found, there wasn't any will. No instructions. Nothing." His hand hovered above the paper, then pulled back. "And yet here it is." The heading was simple: "The Last Will and Testament of Elias Wexler." But below the formal title, the handwriting shifted, no longer the smooth, practiced script of legal declarations, but something more urgent. Certain letters leaned forward as if hurrying to reach the next word. Some were scratched so deep into the paper that you could feel them from the back. I began to read. "On the evening the heir will no longer move, my affairs shall be resolved without the hands of any lawman or priest. This document shall not pass into their keeping, for either will understand the currency in which my debts are to be paid." My eyes went back over the sentence. Alden was watching me now. "Currency?" I asked. "He was a merchant. He's talking about money." Alden's face tightened. "Keep reading. My children are to inherit nothing of my warmth, for warmth is a resource already too dangerous to hold. They will take instead the ice in which I have purchased our continuance. It must remain sealed within the home, in the boards, in the beams, in the marrow of our supper. They will know when to feed it." The room suddenly felt smaller. It was a humid August morning, but I could see my breath faintly clouding between us. Somewhere inside the walls, I thought I heard a slow tick, not the sharp snap of wood in heat, but a wet, deliberate sound, as if the house itself were swallowing. I read on. "The table shall remain as it was on the night of covenant. Chairs unmoved. Plates untaken. The hour fixed. This is not for remembrance, but for containment. Let no stranger sit among us, for the bargain will take from them what it once took from me. I stopped. This is a will? I asked. Alden finally sat, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. I've seen plenty of wills. They name heirs, properties, debts. They don't talk about feeding the house. Then this isn't legal, I said. Legal or not, Alden muttered. It's binding. To him, it was binding. The vault below the eastern wall shall not be opened. The letters within are not to be read by my blood until the day the sun halts in the sky. Until then, let them remain mute, for their voice is hunger. My throat felt dry. We found those letters, I said, recalling the bundle from Chapter 5. They weren't in any vault. Alden didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on a single phrase halfway down the page. I followed his eyes. Should any man not of my blood come to my table and speak the hour aloud, let the air stop for him. Let it take his breath and keep it cold until the end of the season that should be summer. I stepped back from the desk. The phrase, the hour, stuck in my mind, 8:17, the same time frozen on every clock in the Wexler home. I realized Elias had not been speaking metaphorically. This was a condition. A threat. A sentence. Alden spoke slowly. The merchant in Chapter 1 said the air felt wrong. He didn't knock. Maybe he was the first to know what this meant. The thought made me cold in a way no draft could cause. The final paragraph was shorter, but the handwriting was almost violent now, letters stabbed onto the page. I have paid with the breath of strangers, the frost of my own kin, and the stillness of August nights. In return, I have been given years I was never owed. When my body ceases its own motion, let it be placed among the living, that the covenant may not starve. This is my will. This is my warning. Touch not the table. Speak not the hour. And if the air should stop, do not try to move. The ink at the end was smudged. A faint fingerprint, darker than the rest, trailed into the margin. We both stood in silence. The words were not just instructions, they were a confession. Alden finally lifted the candlesticks one by one and folded the will back into a plain brown envelope. His hands were careful, but his jaw was clenched. We're not taking this to the county office, he said. What are you going to do with it? He looked at me, and for a brief moment, I saw in his eyes the same stillness I'd seen in the Wexler dining room, the stillness that did not belong to the living. I'm putting it back, he said. Exactly where it was. Some things, they were never meant to be read twice. As we left the library, I glanced once more at the desk. The red carpet beneath it seemed darker, almost damp. I told myself it was just the shadows, but in the suffocating heat of that summer morning, I could swear I saw a thin rim of frost forming along the edge. By the time we reached the hall, the ticking in the walls had stopped. The will had answered nothing. If anything, it made clear that the Wexler's fate was not an accident, nor even a single night's tragedy. It was the maintenance of something far older, and far more deliberate. The bargain Elias had made was still active. And now, with the discovery of his final instructions, we were closer than ever to breaking it. When the air stopped moving, the road to the Wexler house felt longer that night. Sheriff Adler rode alone, the lantern at his saddle swaying in rhythm with the horse's breath, its light pooling and folding against the darkness. There had been no breeze for 2 days, no whisper in the trees, no rustle of grass, as though the very idea of wind had been erased from the valley. The air was thick, suspended, and each hoofstep rang too clearly in it. He carried Elias Wexler's will in his breast pocket. The final page, the one written in a hand not wholly human, had told him more than he had wanted to know. It was not only a will. It was an instruction. And if the words were to be believed, tonight was the last night to act before the bargain sealed forever. By the time the Wexler house emerged through the black silhouettes of the trees, Adler felt the weight of its silence pressing down. No crickets. No frogs from the marsh. The world seemed to be holding a single breath. Inside, nothing had moved since the night he first found them. The dining room was exactly as it had been. Elias, Martha, the children, hands mid-gesture, eyes wide with an expression that was not fear alone but recognition. Their skin still gleamed faintly, frost blooming in places on the cheeks, the knuckles. The summer heat outside could not touch them. The cold was anchored here. Adler set the lantern down, its light catching on the silverware frozen in midair where a fork's tines just grazed a roast. He pulled the will from his pocket and laid it on the table before Elias's pale fingers. To unmake what was made, the room must be made whole. The seats filled. The seal unbroken. Adler glanced around the table. There were 2 chairs unfilled, one at the far end, one beside the youngest daughter. His jaw tightened. The implication was clear. The merchant's words from weeks ago echoed in his mind, how he had stopped at the gate and felt the air change. Adler understood now. The stillness was not absence but presence, something filling every particle of space, like ice filling a mold. He moved to the first empty chair and sat. The cold rose through the wood into his spine. His breath came out in a cloud, though the lantern flame did not flicker. He stared across at the empty chair at the head of the table, and felt the will's weight in the air. A sound came then, faint, like ice cracking on a distant lake. The Wexler's eyes shifted. Just a fraction, but enough. The stillness was waking. The head chair moved. Not pulled by hands, but by the will of the room itself, sliding out as though in welcome. Adler rose slowly and circled toward it. Every instinct screamed to leave, but the will had spoken of a seal. And seals, once left to their own devices, did not choose mercy. He sat. The air changed at once. The cold was no longer creeping from the wood, it was inside him, threading through veins and bones. The Wexlers blinked in unison. Somewhere beneath the table, water began to drip, though there was no melting. Elias Wexler's mouth opened. No breath emerged, no warmth, only a voice in Adler's head. "You came to witness. Now you will dine." Plates shifted. Food, untouched for months, steamed faintly now, but the steam hung in the air, unmoving, frozen mid-spiral. Adler's eyes darted to the windows. Beyond them, the world was gone. Not darkness. Not light. Nothing. "You made a bargain," Adler said aloud, his voice strange in the air. "What for?" Martha Wexler's lips trembled, a soundless word forming, "forever." The will had said as much between its lines. Elias had sought a kind of preservation, not life, not death, but a moment stolen from the river of time and held fast. The cost was the movement of the world itself. Here, in this room, nothing would decay. Nothing would pass. And nothing would leave. The cold surged, and the lantern's flame locked in place, solid as a sculpture of glass. Adler reached for the will on the table. His fingers met it, but the paper was hard now, brittle as ice. The final line, the one written in the other hand, was changing, letters reshaping before his eyes. "When the air stops moving, you are ours." He shoved the chair back, but the room tightened. The air had weight now, pressing against him, refusing his movement. The Wexlers sat straighter, their heads turning toward him as one. In the silence, Adler heard something vast, not in the room, but all around it. A presence beyond walls, beyond land, cold and patient. It was not the Wexlers doing alone. They were only its keepers. His mind reached for the merchant's warning again, and the truth slammed into him. The man had not feared the stillness because it felt wrong, he had feared it because once inside it, there was no turning back. The dripping beneath the table stopped. The room leaned forward, though nothing physically moved. Adler's heartbeat slowed, each thump farther from the next. He tried to rise, but the cold in his limbs had become part of him, joint by joint locking in place. The Wexlers smiled then, not cruelly, but with the relief of hosts whose final guest has arrived. Outside, unseen, the last breath of wind the valley would ever know sighed against the Wexler house. Then the air stopped moving. 3 days later, a passerby on the main road paused, frowning. The summer air was heavy. Still. Far off, through the trees, a house sat quiet in the distance. He turned away, deciding not to knock.